This morning, I want you to think of your very best friend, if you are fortunate enough to have one. Maybe it's a friend from elementary school, or maybe it's someone you met in high school that you're still in contact with, or maybe it's someone you married. Maybe you married your best friend, or maybe you're separated from your best friend and you haven't been able to talk together or spend time together for a long time. There's a story about two 9-year-old girls who were BFFs in elementary school. Anna Maria and Betty were their names. And in 1939, when they were just 9 years old, they had to say goodbye to one another in their schoolyard. They lived in Europe and their families had to flee Nazi persecution. So Anna Maria's family moved to South America, and Betty's family moved first to China, and then she relocated to Florida. And as these girls grew to young women, they often thought of their best friend and wondered what happened. And then they began to search in survivor databases, trying to find people who had survived the Holocaust, looking for their names, Betty and Anna Maria. And they never connected. They never found each other. Until one day when Betty was giving a presentation about her experiences at a Survivors Foundation event. And as she told her story, one of the staff members remembered a very similar story told by another woman years before. That other woman was Anna Maria. So this foundation got these two women together finally in 2021. They were physically in the same place. Anna Maria and Betty were both 91 years old. They were both widows, and they walked into each other's arms. Betty said, "It felt like coming home." Anna Maria said it was so emotional and so surprising that after all those years, they had never stopped loving one another. That's a love story, isn't it? And I think it's a great example of what Jesus is trying to teach us in our reading this morning. Now, we're in John's Gospel, and we know, don't we, that John's Gospel is full of layers. Lots of layers. We can't just read it and think we know what it's saying. We need to dig down and see what else is there for us to discover. And we also see a very high Christology in John's Gospel, and that means that Jesus is portrayed as divine right from the beginning. From John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word took on flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus is portrayed as divine from the very first sentence. And when we read what Jesus says, we read it as if he is God, and that is what the author intended, right? So in our reading today, John's Gospel, Jesus is saying, this is what love looks like. I want you to love one another, and this is how you do it. Now, David S. Cunningham, a scholar who wrote about this text, said that the word love here in the Greek language is agape. Now, we know that in our language we have one word for love, right? Love. But in Greek, there's at least 8 different variations of the word love. Words like philia, which is brotherly love, and ludus, which is a childish, very naive kind of love, a playful love. And there's eros, which is our sexual love, erotic love. And then there's agape, which is a universal kind of love. It's a love where we feel loving toward all, toward everyone, toward all of creation. And it's not so much a feeling as it is a state of being. That's agape. And that's what Jesus is using in this text, at least according to John, the writer of this gospel. So Cunningham goes on to say, whenever we see love in the text, it's an ambiguous word, and it really needs definition. We need to look at the text and kind of define what is this love that Jesus is talking about. So I took Cunningham's advice, and I began to dig into this text to see what kind of love Jesus is describing. So he starts out by saying, this is what love looks like. The Father loves me, I love the Father, and so I obey God's commands. So for Jesus, obedience of the commands is how we show love. And then Jesus says to his disciples, if you're my friends, you'll obey my commands. And Jesus' command is to love one another. Now, when we read that text, we don't have any problems with it, especially if we have on our high Christology glasses, because we know that God gives us commands and expects us to follow them, right? And so Jesus would also give commands and expect his disciples to follow the command. But when I read it differently, when I read it as if I was a 9-year-old kid in the schoolyard with my best friend, and I look at what Jesus said, it sounds a little bit more like the schoolyard bully. You're not going to be my friend unless you follow my commandments. You're not going to be my friend anymore if you don't do what I tell you to do. Now, when my kids did that when they were little, you're not going to be my friend. I'm not going to be your friend. I get after them immediately. I can't stand it when kids do that to one another. And I would say, you cannot treat your friends that way. You have to be kind to them. They don't always have to do what you tell them to do. So if we see Jesus as God in this text, we're okay with this language. But if Jesus is just a person we know, and they use language like this, it is not cool. Now, Jesus, of course, was an observant Jew. He understood how to keep commandments. In the Old Testament, there's something like 613 commandments, right? And Jesus would have been familiar with those. And of course, we have the 10 commandments that we know all about. At least I hope we do. We will by the end of our time together today. But one thing we've got to remember about love. Love is unconditional. That means you can't say, I will love you if you cook my dinner every night or whatever. You know, you can't put conditions on love. Otherwise, it's not love anymore. It's an agreement. It's a deal. It's not love. Love should be agape, right? It should be unconditional. It should be universal for all. But Jesus, in his context, is connecting love to obeying commandments, to obedience. And I think that we all struggle, and especially in a church setting, with distinguishing between love and obedience or control. Because there are a lot of religious groups that are high control and they call that love, and I don't think it is. So what I want us to do today is go through those Old Testament commandments and just ask ourselves, are they loving? Is there love in these commandments? Just to see, let's see if obedience and love are the same. And since there's 613 Old Testament commandments, we should finish about 3:15 p.m. on Thursday. So, because time is important, let's just do 10. Let's do the 10 commandments. And here's what we're looking for. Is this loving? Does this create space for us to be loving people, to love one another, which is what Jesus tells us to do, okay? All right, so I'm going to go through these 10 commandments quickly. They're in your Bible in two places. If you are really bored this afternoon, look up Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. Those are sort of bookends. In Exodus chapter 20, when Moses first brings down the 10 commandments from the mountain, the people will begin their 40-year vacation in the wilderness. And Deuteronomy chapter 5, they are ending their 40-year vacation in the wilderness, and the next generation gets a refresher of those 10 commandments, and they are a little bit different. So sometimes we say, oh, I remember this one says do not lie, and that one says do not bear false witness. This one says remember the Sabbath. This one says keep the Sabbath. There are just small differences between those two sets of commandments, but I'm going to go with the more generally accepted list of 10 commandments this morning. So the first three are very closely related. The first one, of course, is I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me, right? Other gods? What other gods would we have? When we see a commandment like that that's specific that way, it means that at the time there were other gods. There were quite a few of them. There was a storm god, a fertility god, a harvest god, the god of the sun, the god of the moon, all kinds of gods at that time. And this particular God is saying, I'm the only God for you. You don't get any of these other gods. Okay, so it's Not so much a commandment of love, but a commandment of definition, right? The second commandment is just like it. You shall not make any carving of anything in nature and worship it. No idols for you. Again, very specific, because guess what people were doing at that time? They were making carvings and they were worshiping them. And you can read about that in the Old Testament. It's somewhere in Genesis where Rachel steals the household gods, and it causes a big problem because they have these little statues in their homes and they worship them. They pray to them. Those are their gods. And Rachel steals her family gods, and it's a problem. So I've heard contemporary ministers say, you know, what's your idol today? It could be your job, could be your family or your checkbook, or that's a nice parallel, but that is not what the second commandment's talking about. The second commandment is talking about actual stone or wood idols that you have in your house that you pray to, okay? Again, not so much love here, but definition. The third command is just like these other two. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember that one? OMG. Everybody breaks that one on the regular. Almost everybody I know, I have heard drop the name of God, maybe in not the best manner, not looking around at anybody here, of course. But we do it all the time. And if we had a Jewish rabbi here, we would ask, and the rabbi would tell us, well, there's like 5 different layers of how you might take the name of the Lord your God in vain, and you don't have to worry too much about OMG, which is great, because if you read the rest of that commandment, it says that that is an unpardonable sin. If you use or misuse the name of God, you will not be found blameless, it says. Yikes, that's kind of scary. Not a whole lot of love there. But again, definition, maybe a little more control, getting the foundation set for the rest of these commandments, all right? Now the fourth one, I always loved, and it is, you shall remember and keep the Sabbath day. You do all your work on 6 days. 1 day you get to rest, and self-care. I thought this is a great commandment. I absolutely love it. Everybody should do this. And then this week I read the rest of it. And I don't think I've ever paid attention to the rest of the words. Because what it says is, you work for 6 days, you get 1 day off, and so does your slave. My slave? So you mean, God, you don't have a problem with me having slaves as long as I give them 1 day off a week? Okay, it was a great idea to have 1 day of rest, but not if you're a slave. Now, it could have been pretty progressive, because maybe up to this point, slaves worked nonstop. And to get 1 day off to rest, if you're a slave, maybe was an incredible movement of progress. I don't know for sure. But I think this would have been a great opportunity for God to say, do not enslave people, period. Can you imagine how different our history would be if that had been in the 10 Commandments? So the day of rest, absolutely. Self-care, that's love-giving, but your slaves, I got a little problem with that. That's more control. Okay, honor your father and mother. Another great idea, especially if your parents were like mine. My parents were wonderful. They took care of us. We always had a house. We had food. We had clothing. We had everything we needed. We had a safe environment. We went to school. We went to church. We did all the things. I love to honor my parents. But what if your parents were terrible? What if your parents abused you, neglected you, molested you? We hear stories about things that parents do to children, and it's terrible. Are they still supposed to honor that? There's no loophole here. There's no exception. It says, honor your father and mother that it may go well with you and you may dwell long have many days in the land that the Lord your God gives you. It's all about blessing if you honor your parents, but I'm just saying, is that true for everybody? I'm just asking the questions. And I know some of these might be a little uncomfortable for you. And if they bother you, don't kill me, because that's the next commandment. And I'm really happy to report, thou shalt not kill. But here again, funny how This doesn't give us exceptions, but we make exceptions to this one. Do not kill. We make exceptions at times of war, don't we? Because many people were forced to go someplace and do things they never would have done in any other context, and that can't be their fault. So we excuse that. We make this exception. The trouble I have with do not kill, even though that's love, right? If we don't kill one another, that's got to create more love. The greatest exception to this commandment is God. Because God goes on to tell the Israelites to go into all of these other communities and nations and take their land. Almost 60 communities, tribes, nations, family units that the Israelites were commanded to go in and take their land. And if the people resisted, if they stood and fought for their property, for their homes, then they were to be killed. Kill the men, kill the married women, take the children as slaves. Here's the slaves again. This was common practice. So sure, do not kill, wonderful commandment, but let's see our own God and our own nation follow the commandment. If that's important to us, is it right for our government to send aid to other places in times of war? I'm just asking the questions. Just want you to think about it. I want you to use your brain this morning. We just flippantly think we know what these 10 commandments are, but do we? Have we ever sat down and thought about them? Because that's what my goal is today, to get you to think about these. Number 7, don't commit adultery. Okay, God gets points for this one. Adultery hurts people, right? If you're going to have that problem, just end your relationship and go off and do what you're going to do. I'm okay with that as far as a space for love. And what about rape? I mean, that's not in here. Doesn't that hurt people more? If we assault someone? Wouldn't it have been an easy addition for God to add in the 10 commandments here? Do not commit adultery and do not force anyone. I think that might have been something that somehow got missed, because you know it was a problem back then. There are all kinds of stories in the Old Testament, a couple that are coming to mind right now, when fathers send their virgin daughters out to be hurt, assaulted by groups of other people. And it's terrible. But that's okay? Okay, just asking the questions, looking for the love. Stay with me, we're almost done. Don't steal. Again, great commandment. It leaves room for love. If we don't take what's not ours, I don't have any problem with that. But again, what are the exceptions? When is it okay to steal? Is it ever okay to steal? The commandment says, do not steal, period. What if you're a refugee family? What if you haven't eaten, your kids haven't eaten for 2 days? What if you come across some food and it's not yours? Are you not going to steal it? Are you going to say, no, I must obey the commandment and maybe bury one of my children? I'm just saying there should be some loophole here, because at some point in time, keeping the commandment is less loving than breaking the commandment. That's my point. And you can all think of hypothetical times when that might be true, and you might look back in history and see times when that is true. Okay, don't lie. Again, if someone asks me, do I look fat in these pants? I just want to lie, and I'm going to have to say they look great. We can't be mean to people. When is it more loving to break the commandment? What if Anna Maria's family came to us because they were fleeing from persecution, and we put them in the upper room? And then the authorities come and ask us, are you harboring fugitives in your church? What are you going to say? Are you going to say, I'm going to keep the commandment because I know I can't lie. So yes, we are, officer. They're up in the upper room. Or are you going to lie and save their lives? When is it more loving, to keep the commandment or to break it? Are you seeing how difficult this can be? Is this bothering you a little? It should bother you a little, because it bothered me all week. The last one, okay, I'll just dive right in. Aren't you glad there's only 10? Don't covet your neighbor's house or your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's slave. Here we are again. Or your neighbor's ox or your neighbor's donkey. Don't covet any of those things. Ladies, if you're a married woman, you are right in there between the house and the slaves. These were written for men by men. We are not in there. There's nothing that says don't covet your neighbor's spouse. It was specifically don't covet your neighbor's wife. Now, if somebody wanted to take these 10 commandments and put them out here on the courthouse lawn, I would be the first to object. And I am a follower of Christ. We don't want commandments that are this ambiguous and this difficult to follow, who almost endorse slavery, who keep women in a minor role as property. We shouldn't have them in a public place. I want you to really think about this today. It should bother you a little. It bothers me, and I think it bothered Jesus. Jesus knew all of this. He knew these commands. He knew what they meant. And he said, I'm giving you all a new one. Love one another. I feel like Jesus must have looked at these commandments and said, where is the love? I know love is what it's all about, but I'm not finding love in the keeping of these commandments. So Jesus gives a new one. And he says the result of that, if you keep that commandment, you will have joy. And that's what Anna Maria and Betty had. When they came together, when they had kept that commandment, when they loved one another through 82 years of separation, they had great joy. They spent 4 days together. They talked and they shopped and they ate and they drank champagne. And they had a wonderful reunion. And they still loved one another. And they had joy. So today, I want you to think about a new commandment, or maybe 10. I wrote 10, but time. I'm not going to share my 10. I'll give you a couple just to get you thinking. What if we had a commandment that simply said, practice gratitude? No matter how bad your day is, thou shalt practice gratitude. Find one thing to be grateful for. Wouldn't that leave some space to be more loving? What about be more kind? Thank you to Don Tassi for that one. Couldn't that have been one of the commandments? Would that have left a little more room for love? No matter where you are or how unkind you are, if each day you could just be a little more kind, wouldn't that be a better world? What about do not enslave people? Period. Imagine the history of our nation. Imagine the world's history if that had come down off that mountain with Moses. How would our world be different? When you're mad, put yourself in time out. Wouldn't that help us all tremendously? Wouldn't there be more love? Okay, so now you see where I'm going. I'm not going to share all 10 of mine with you, but I want you to imagine for yourself a commandment that would make this world a more loving place. And don't steal Jesus's. Love one another. We have to define love. That's what Cunningham said. We need to define it, so define it. How would it look in the world if your commandment was part of the 10 commandments or was a new commandment? What will your commandment be?